Hi, you know me, I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, historian, philosopher, and Thomas Jefferson scholar. And today we are working without our host, Donna Vitek, who couldn't make it. So we'll have to do it without her. This is One Word, Five Questions, episode number 73. And the aim of the show, if you haven't figured out by now, is to introduce you to the deep and wide mind of Thomas Jefferson by focusing on one work of Thomas Jefferson, oftentimes analyzing that work thoroughly, and at other times just using it as a springboard for further discussion about Thomas Jefferson to get to know him a little bit better. Unlike other scholars who customarily admit that Jefferson was perplexing and a walking contradiction, I think Jefferson was perplexing, but not in the least contradictory. I think the difficulties of Jefferson scholarship come only insofar as scholars lack the depth of his understanding on issues and the breadth of his understanding on issues. So it's just a lot of work. So the aim of this show is to introduce you to Thomas Jefferson, try to get to know him. This is the 73rd episode. And today we look at Thomas Jefferson's views on history with a focus on the Roman historian Publius Cornelius Tacitus, born at 56 AD and died in 120 AD. Jefferson, the focus here will be a letter that Jefferson writes to his granddaughter, Anne Carey Randolph Bankhead, and he tells of his profound love of Tacitus. Today, we are lucky enough to have Dr. Brian Dotz from the University of Georgia with us, who has written before on Jefferson and Tacitus. He's not focused exclusively on Jefferson as a scholar, but he's knowledgeable of Jefferson on history and Jefferson on Tacitus. And we're lucky to have him, and he's going to share his expertise with us today. So this is One Word, Five Questions. The letter is Jefferson's letter to granddaughter Anne Carey Randolph Bankhead of December 8, 1808. And without further ado, let us begin the show. So let's introduce Dr. Brian Dotz. And Brian, if you allow me to be informal, call you Brian. You can just call me Mark. And tell us about yourself and about your interest in Jefferson.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mark, for having me on the show today. My interest in Jefferson began long ago. I earned a bachelor's and a master's degrees in political science, and Jefferson's political theories always intrigued me. While my PhD is in education policy studies and foundations, which extended my interest in politics and history generally, and Jefferson's not a primary focus of mine, as you mentioned in the introduction, but I've continued to have interest in his ideas, especially in his educational ideas. So that ended up with me writing a couple pieces on him, including the one on Tacitus.
Okay. Well, let's start. Let's get to the second question. We're going to be referring especially to this essay that you wrote some years ago on Jefferson and Tacitus. First question concerns your appropriation of a term, socialized conscience, apropos of Thomas Jefferson. What do you mean by that, and how does that tie into appreciation of Tacitus?
Sure. As I explained in the article on Jefferson's use of Tacitus, and based on Frank Shuffleton's use of the term, Jefferson's socialized conscience was informed by a multi-dimensional context of people, events, and academic knowledge, all balanced by both reason and sentiment. I think Jefferson's educational goals were key to developing a socialized conscience in children, akin to Aristotle's idea that males could not reach their potential without involvement in politics, for example. For Jefferson, this involvement appears to include male participation in respective local government responsibilities in Virginia. In other words, education was to develop literacy, of course, but also expected to deepen students' appreciation for and use of classical education, including reading Tacitus's histories, And what interested Jefferson, I think, in Tacitus was his ability to write history by telling moral tales, especially of Republican heroes who fought against tyrants to protect citizens' liberties and the public interest. And of course, this fed into Jefferson's broader understanding of Republican history. And with the beginning of the new nation after the separation with England, that certainly resulted in Jefferson continuing his interest in public education, despite the fact that his proposals were rejected. But I believe he wanted children at least to be read these moral tales that were published by Tacitus.
Yeah, I'll get into that a little bit. That takes us to a sort of distinction between disinterested history, to which Jefferson was always committed. In other words, historian just not having biases in a sense, but in some sense, this commitment to moral history is interested history. So I'll get to that in a bit. One of the things you brought up with the sense of social consciousness that I've written on, scholars typically paint Jefferson either as a Lockean liberal, committed to individualism, a strong sense of individualism and individual rights, and that the political system, his republic, is devoted to as much liberty as individuals can have. And then you have the classical Republican interpretation. The liberal interpretation is advocated by people like Joyce Appleby and Luigi Marco Pisani. Classical Republicans take him back to like this Tacitian framework, the Ciceronian, I better call it Ciceronian framework, where individuals, applies to Aristotle and Plato, individuals are members of a political community, and the obligation is first and foremost to the political community. So it seems to me that these two interpretations are mutually exclusive. Is your primary duty to the individuals, or is the primary duty towards the state? My view has always been both. Now, because both are axial primary duties, I called this in my first book, and luckily I haven't changed my mind since then. I call it liberal eudaimonism, from evdaimonia, from the Greek, meaning good God or happiness. So I claim this is a false dichotomy, that Jefferson was both a classical Republican in a sense and a Lockean liberal. He was a Lockean liberal very blatantly and openly in his political thinking. But you mentioned sentiment, right?
Yes.
And sentiment is his moral sense theory. And his moral sense theory is, scholars typically leave that out when they talk about Jefferson's politics, and you can't do that because he thought all human beings had a moral sense, and that means we had moral obligations to other people, obligations to the state. So I take the classical Republican, Lockean liberal dichotomy or discussion as a false dichotomy. I think he was both.
Yeah, I think as far as the federal government is concerned, he tends to focus more on, what we call today negative liberty. And the Lockean idea of freedom fits very well with his ideas of the federal government. But as we move closer and closer to local government, the ward community, Jefferson seems to develop this greater concern for sentiment, emotions, feelings. A community has responsibility for its members. He seemed to reveal a faith in citizens' capacity to govern themselves in their respective wards. He suggested that they choose, their own justices, as you know, as well as constables or sheriffs, what we call today, military company, a patrol, as he explains, public roads, the choice of one or more jurors to serve on some court, the delivery of votes for elective offices. And
now, notice you're getting into some of the not just negative liberty, but positive liberty, in the sense that government has some obligations to do things that is not just a negative sense, to build roads, for public education, things like that, right?
Yeah, to develop better citizens. And of course, one of the ways that he sought to do that was to establish public schools.
Yeah, that was very, very important there. All right, let's go on to question number 3. Looking at the letter is long, of course, and the passage to which we're going to focus is very, very small. Okay, Jefferson has some preliminary comments on the tree, Mimosa nilotica, the turns to Anne's choice of winter reading. In a prior letter on November 26, 1808, his granddaughter talks about reading Thompson's Caesars and reading Tacitus. And Jefferson, in this letter, says, Tacitus I consider as the first writer in the world without a single exception. This book is a compound of history and morality of which we have no other example. Now, with so many great, in his one of his other granddaughters mentioned that he was often found more often found with the book on ancient writers, philosophers, historians, moralists, orators, and stuff than any other book. Why does he single out Tacitus and not Livy or Herodotus or Thucydides?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I think while he admires all of those writers and certainly suggests to many of his readers and people he corresponded with that they read a variety of works, he seems to prioritize Tacitus's works because rarely are moral decisions depicted as simple choices in Tacitus's histories, for example. Based on complicated context, moral decisions may appear at first to be immoral, but turn out to be virtuous. And his
Well, you're bringing in complexity, which I think is kind of an interesting. Would you so part of the answer at least is that Tacitus is a friend to introducing us to complex scenarios for moral decision making.
Yes, yeah, his histories reveal an imperfect world where Republican heroes are caught up in complex political circumstances, but who put the love of their country and its republicanism above self-interest. And I think Tacitus's works depicted the constant tension between guarding individual liberties uh, with always trying to balance those liberties with the public interest. And real life circumstances often challenge this moral balance. And the Republican heroes who achieved such a balance provided the moral exemplars found in Tacitus's works that Jefferson, uh, you know, prioritized in his thinking.
Yeah, anything to say now? Tacitus, just a little looked up. He wrote in '98 his Agricola, which was a biography of his father-in-law, and that was a fascinating. In that work, in some of the works, maybe you can talk about this, like the Agricola and Germania, he focuses on this dichotomy between liberty and corruption and so forth. So the suggestion is in both of these works written in '98 that part of the focus is he's looking at uncomplicated situations for living and looking at the beautiful liberty that people experience in those situations. Whereas when you get into large societies like a Roman Republic, that liberty seems to be almost impossible. Could you go ahead? I'm sorry, but I was going to say something in answering that question. Could you also say, do you have anything to say about Tacitus's literary style?
Well, the focus on morality, I think Jefferson, while he doesn't say this extensively in any of his educational proposals, I think his style uh, not only connected well with his existing understanding of Whig history. I think his writings, like in the histories, for example, uh, he just thought that the style of his prose and so forth would be accessible to a wide variety of individuals.
So he's looking for a wide audience. He's not looking at necessarily just an educated audience.
Right.
And of course, that leans nicely with moral lessons, because Jefferson's love of Jesus, which he developed so somewhat in his mature years, in his 40s and so forth, was, I think, predicated on that morality really is simple. It's love of God and love of other people, and being truthful. And, it's really quite simple. So you can get into these, as I see it, you can get into these horribly complex moral situations. And when you try to disentangle the complexity through thinking, you get confused. But Jefferson, through his moral sense, says, look, we just know what to do. It's the thinking that gets us in trouble. And some of the things I was astonished to find out that I actually wrote a short section on Jefferson and Tacitus in my book on Jefferson morality. So I did some research. Had forgotten that I'd written that. But one of the things, so Tacitus, maybe you can talk about this. Tacitus had a breviloquent, a sort of brief, an eloquent style that focused on clarity and brevity and clarity of expression and conciseness of expression. And Latin was perfect for that, whereas other people always brought in all sorts of flowery language and embellishment, metaphor, and all sorts of things. And Tacitus used speeches that were invented, obviously, for clarity. So, any comments on those things?
Well, interesting. I think all of it just comes together to show the difficulty in maintaining a what Jefferson considered a Republican form of government. Very fragile. History had taught that they collapse more easily, and therefore it takes literate citizens, educated citizens, to make sure that they are well aware of how to balance their individual liberties with the public interest.
And this is where his is it not where his Lockean atomism comes in, where Jefferson always says you divide and divide again. So how can you have a large, and he says in his second inaugural address, the larger the republic, and he's not speaking of a Roman republic, his Jeffersonian republic, the more stable it can be, because these local incendiary situations get washed away. As long as you divide the country into states, and the states into counties, and counties into wards, and wards are families. And, the primary interest, the focus for the most part, is on the individual. But as I say, a participatory individual with rights guaranteed by the government, but the individual giving back to the government. So if you keep dividing, it could work, right?
Right. Very, very existential at the ward level. Citizens taking part in governing one another.
And it very much depended, as I see it, on his moral sense, that everybody he believed had a moral sense that was roughly comparable and equal. And that helped us make decisions. Now, is this a sense of Jefferson being naive? I've said that at times. To what extent are we moral beings, to the extent that Jefferson thinks? You mentioned his optimism, but was he naively optimistic?
Well, it's hard to tell, but I think that, his proposals for education were to provide the sort of buttressing the Republic of Virginia as a whole, but of course prepare children with the basics, at least, so that they could govern themselves at the local level. So he wasn't, I don't know if he was overly optimistic. Without education, he seemed to think that the Republican government would fail.
Clearly, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, what history taught him. So I think that his exploration of Tacitus, and of course, is it Germania? That work, which is more of an ethnographic work. I think that also played into his ideas of local government, the power of citizens to at least locally develop. He doesn't call them democracies; they're little republics, but they provide the parameters of which, local families can come together and govern themselves reasonably. But of course, that all depends on at least basic education.
Yeah, and that takes, I mean, you're sort of answering my fourth question here. When you go to the Germanica and you start talking about the German tribes of the time and what are the lessons we learned from the German tribes in the Roman Republic and the problems that they caused for the Roman Republic. So the question was, you state that the American colonies are in some sense comparable to the Germanic tribes, while England is comparable to the Roman Republic. You want to elaborate on that?
So, certainly. Tacitus' exploration of Germania appears similar to what we call ethnography today, examining, analyzing, and working toward a better understanding of the peoples of Germany. But Tacitus's histories portrayed a Roman Empire deteriorating from within and Republican heroes attempting to save it. And that Germany provided Tacitus with an ideal for Rome from which to aspire, and Jefferson intended America to provide an ideal Republican exemplar to England. So we see, in my opinion, we see from his work that that exemplar comes to the fore again to show England what a Republican government is supposed to look like, and the development of that Republican government. Moreover, Jefferson attempted to enact a variety of proposals that he learned from Republican or Whig historians, including, the basic public education, of course, higher education for academically gifted males. He proposed giving 50 acres of land to all white males to buttress their political and economic independence. And I think this is all connected to the tribal governments that existed in Germania. And such agrarian laws, as they were often called, were seen as necessary ingredients in helping maintain Republican governments because it protected that political and economic independence, just like education was expected to protect intellectual independence.
Yeah, there needed to be a lot of reforms geared towards the guaranteeing the rights of individuals. You mentioned education entails primogeniture. Education to me was the big thing because you mentioned in his draft constitution for Virginia, he talks about giving each individual, each white male, 50 acres of land. If you have 25, you get 25 more. The idea is to get everybody roughly an equal starting point, right? And if you get rid of entails, primogeniture, things like that, the wealthy people of today will be, everything will be leveled off. The privilege will be gone, and we will be able to work towards this natural aristocracy for Jefferson based on morality and ability and intelligence, right? But it was all, and one thing we didn't mention, freedom of religion, right?
Mm-hmm. Certainly.
Very, very important.
Yeah.
And I want to say something about, maybe you'll have some comments, is that Jefferson's focus on Tacitus, as you mentioned quite rightly, is that Tacitus gives us these moral lessons. And he mentions, I think in a letter to 1771 letter to Robert Skipwith, who ends up being a relative marrying into the family, that historical moral lessons are few and far between, maybe not so much in Tacitus. And that's why he says that's why fiction is important. Because if you write fiction, you can, weave your morality in there. So in my last book called The Disease of Liberty, Jefferson on History and Liberty, I talk about a commitment to, a verbal commitment to disinterested history, to having no biases when you write it. And yet Jefferson makes this commitment towards morality, which is interested. Now, I argue you can get out of this, that this is another false dichotomy insofar as history can be practiced, can be pursued interestedly, but practiced disinterestedly. In other words, I might have an interest in moral history, so I seek out people who write moral history. But once you write the moral history, you have to be dispassionate or disinterested. Because
Mhm.
morality for him is something real. It's not something we just invent like some historians think. So if I talk about someone being a morally corrupt person, there's no problem with addressing that so long as I'm speaking accurately. And the idea, as you mentioned as well, is that Jefferson envisages a community of individuals, each giving back to the community, and that requires moral persons, persons with a sense of giving back to other people, right? So my view is that you can be interested, you can have an interest in moral history, though that doesn't exhaust all the history in which you're interested. But once you pick, or once you write interested history, you have to be dispassionate. You have to be, in other words, willing to change your mind on assessments and things given new evidence that might come to your disposal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're exactly right.
Okay. Well, let's go to the last question. This is a big one. And I know you have a lot to say on this. Jefferson's detestation of Hume's History of England. I played around with this in several publications, and I know you probably have too. What is it that Jefferson found unattractive about Hume as an historian? He was one of the great men of his time.
Yeah, and I guess the the one thing that it sort of worried Jefferson that because Hume was such a good writer, according to Jefferson himself, that he thought that Hume could attract young readers to his particular slant in history. And Jefferson understood Hume's historical biases as favoring monarchy, the Tory view of history, for example. And while Jefferson did support adult or older children or young adults in college, being exposed to Hume's histories, he wanted to establish in young children, to the extent possible in these primary schools, an understanding of Whig history in this Tacitus's kind of history that celebrated Republican heroes, representative government, public good, without the focus on celebrating monarchy and royalty and kingdoms, for example. So I think that this Whig history that Jefferson was well versed in, it's my understanding that not all of it is true, but it certainly fit his Republican ideals, this Republican canon.
So he had it. It's fair to say certain biases when it came to construction of history, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I want to penetrate a little bit. I don't know how much I've done quite a bit of work on Jefferson and Whig history, and it's like you said, he was committed to Hume being, and Hume is a very, very good writer, very clear in expression. And Jefferson talks about, he says Hume's book is plausible and pleasing in its style and manner. And because of those things, it instills quietly the errors and heresies of British Toryism into young minds. Now, here's another quote from Jefferson to George Lewis in 1825, towards the end of his life. Hume's history, were it faithful, would be the finest piece of history which has ever been written by man. Its unfortunate bias may be partly ascribed to the accident of his having written it backwards. So, and he's looking at, and he's drawing from Hume a distinction between Tory and Whig history. And Hume objected to that. I actually did some work on Hume on this because I'm very attracted to Hume as a scholar. And Hume does talk about Whig interpretations, and he is against that, not insofar as he's against Whiggism or Whig history. He's against people reading back that far, Tory Whig distinction back that far in history. His point was it never existed.
Yeah.
And so he thinks like people like Jefferson reading Whig history back into the past are misrepresenting the period.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think Jefferson believed much of that history. I mean, you probably know more than I do, Mark, about that, but I think Jefferson believed much of that history, which was actually myth. Is that
Yeah.
and but he seems to look at Jefferson seems to look at this Whig history, um, while he thought it was accurate, he likes it nonetheless that, it sort of parallels the ideas pursued in Tacitus. Not everything in Tacitus's histories, at least it's my understanding, were factual, and Jefferson knew that, but he thought
Sure.
that the moral tales, whether fiction or nonfiction, would provide the kinds of benefits to children at a young age to learn and establish really strong roots. Because as we know, as you're socialized, as children from the family and from your early schooling, that socialization becomes well rooted in the mind. And not that it can't change, of course, over time, but Jefferson seems to be trying to guard that view of history in children at an early age so that it becomes well established and firm. Not that they, of course, can change their minds. He's open to the idea of them reading Hume eventually as they grow older, just like he's open to the idea of introducing a variety of religious scriptures or a plurality of religious views to young adults and college students.
Um, I've read Hume's political essays and so forth, many of them, and Hume does not have a bias towards monarchy. And it says that. He says the only extent, were I to propose a path for England, it would be monarchy because it already is a monarchy. To switch over to, to something like a Jeffersonian republic would be complex. And monarchies can be fine if they're conducted with an eye towards the rights of the people and so forth. There's nothing inherently bad about a monarchy. So maybe Jefferson's views on his detestation of monarchy, he's looking at what the British government has done to the colonial Americans, and he's thinking that, well, all monarchies have those biases, and then there's the inbreeding going on, and
Mhm.
so I mean, in
And
some
the
sense,
institutional means within which monarchy and potential corruption continue.
yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of the world and passing on, governmental authority from within a family and so forth, I'm with Jefferson. That's not the right way to do it because what guarantees that you're going to have a good person ruling and an intelligent person? Why not open things up so that all people have a capacity to be rulers and leaders? And then you get the most morality abiding and intelligent people, at least presumably. That's what Jefferson hoped, is that make a good point. You want to read things like Tacitus because it's not that it's going to give you moral lessons because we already know right from wrong. We're born that. But what's going to happen is going to reinforce in the
Mhm.
mind that we need to act that way. Whereas that's where he always says, the plowman can make moral decisions much better than the statesman because the plowman just knows and he doesn't have all these books on morality that he read. You don't read books on morality to know what to do. You read them to give you a little push to do the right thing when you
Mhm.
know you need to do the right thing.
And to learn how to navigate morality in various contexts, for example.
Yeah, and I tend to think, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I tend to think is that the complications of context are not always as troublesome, as labyrinthine as they might seem. It's just that we get ourselves in a fairly complex moral situation. We try to reason out of it, and that's just the wrong thing to do. because Jefferson is clear in several writings that reason and morality are separate faculties. We know the right thing to do. Adding reason to the mix adds for corruption. Now, one last thing is that for his professorship of political thinking at University of Virginia, he talks about Locke's essay on the true original second essay on government, Sidney Discourses on Government, the Federalists, the authors of the Federalist Papers, Madison's Virginia Resolutions, the Declaration of Independence. I think he even mentions George Washington's farewell address, which was written by Madison, was it not? So these are the sort of writings. Do you have anything to say? I mean, here's a perplexity for me. It's very clear that scholars jump all over Jefferson for being biased himself when it comes to the sorts of readings, but he's also advocating readings that are, there's your laugh, gotta get the picture, that are advocating freedom and open discussion and power in the people. Is that such a bad bias in your estimation? I waver on that.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Well, the readings and everything he's talking about is power in the hands of the people and individual rights, and not corrupt, not strong centralized government and so forth. So in a sense, he's advocating free discussion. If you can politicize that, say it's a political view, in a sense it is, but it's also, in some sense, seems to me the right view.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you have anything to say on that? Do you think it's...
I think, political discussion and discourse, deliberations and so forth, I think that all comes into play for Jefferson as well. And of course, in his wards, of course, that would take place at the local level. And I agree that seems to be important from my reading of Jefferson.
Yeah, it's just, I'm doing work on Ukraine and, of course, Russia and so forth. And you see in Russia today, the state has such tight control over what goes on and what you can say, what you can do, what you can read, the sort of movies you can watch. And in my book on Disease of Liberty, I talk about two prominent Ukrainian people who were working for the Russian government, came to the United States and said, you can't understand. Those of you who live here will never understand what it means to go from Russia to go to the United States and then breathe free air. You don't get it. You don't know what you have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Jefferson was fighting for that. And it's just a beautiful fight.
Yeah. It's, as long as people have basic education and education generally, he wanted to create that system that would help filter out, as you said, natural aristocrats. And, deliberation. I think the more you have in the conversation, the greater your understanding of the variety of perspectives and so forth.
Very John Stuart Mill stuff, huh?
Yeah.
Right. It's the same thing as on liberty. You get the same argument. You have this variety of situations and open discussion, and it leads to it hopefully generates truths. Yeah. And that's what or at least are working towards a better understanding of situations. Yeah. All right, my friend, we've got under a minute to go. I want to thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise and your opinions on and helping us understand Jefferson's approach to history as being moral discussion. And I want to wish you any plans on retiring soon?
No.
Okay, got to pay the bills.
Sometimes I'd like to, but no plans yet.
All right, you have a great day. I will cap this off, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
You too, Mark, and thank you.